Welcome to breakout session number 4, Colorado and Denver legal marijuana enforcement. At the table today we have 3 groups among many that regulate marijuana. I'm with the Department of Excise and Licenses. I have Jim Burak, who is the director of the MED, and Detective Paul Street with the Denver Police Department. Like I said, I'm the Compliance Program Administrator for the Department of Excise and Licenses. I was formerly with the City Attorney's Office. I worked for Marley, who I'm sure you've all seen speak. I was brought down to the Department of Excise and Licenses about 7 months ago with the goal of kind of streamlining or standardizing how we're investigating and inspecting marijuana industry. So how does fire do it, and how do they write their reports and refer up to the city attorney's office, and then assisting with DPD and adding what we could do and make it a more formalized, streamlined process. Sorry, I should have clicked that slide. So with our compliance program and the maturing of the marijuana industry, what we're trying to do, hopefully, is have a more mature inspection process. So instead of running around to every marijuana business and at least making sure they're meeting certain safety standards, what we're trying to do is do a more in-depth investigation and a more in-depth report so we can collect statistics on what these places are doing and where either we are failing or where they are failing on every rule. So just saying that it's safe and it's good and we're going to move along, we're going more in depth at this point. Hopefully that's going to be able to create clear expectations for the industry after we've collected enough data that we can put out there to the industry and say, you know, this is where 60% of you are failing. These are the standards that we're looking for. Hopefully we can, like I said, with the maturing of the industry, bring everybody to that same high level. This next slide, you don't have to look at, but I wanted to throw it in there. It's a mess, but inspecting these places is tough because you could go in there and they could have some very simple minor violations that they didn't know about or that they could correct on site. And so we kind of have a system of doing that. Or they could have what we call moderate violations where it requires a report and follow-up, or major violations where we need to get other agencies involved. And this is kind of some of the work that I've been doing in terms of what do we do about that, because we have 5 inspectors and a chief inspector. And over the 8 years that we've been doing this, everybody kind of developed their own system of doing things. Everybody had a territory. So one person could walk into a facility and say, these are your 3 problems and these are how I want you to correct it. Whereas another inspector could do something completely different. And the industry was telling us we're kind of getting inconsistent messages. So one of my goals is to standardize all of the work that we're doing, and we're all looking for the same things, and we're holding everybody to the same standards. So that's what my role is in marijuana. I'm up here, like I said, with Jim and Paul, and they're going to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to have a series of questions for both of them, and then I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions from the audience. So, Jim, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Very well. Okay, good morning. I'm Jim Burak. I'm the director of the Marijuana Enforcement Division, and it's a true privilege to be here and gratified to see a large turnout, so appreciate being part of the conversation. I'm here today. I've been with MED since 2014, initially as the Chief of Investigations, which is effectively the number 2 at MED, and then in 2016 took on and was promoted to into the director role. I do want to say there are obviously a number of friends out there and colleagues that I've worked with for the last nearly 5 years, and so we may have 3 folks up here, but I know I have many lifelines out there. So as we have this conversation amongst us, that there are a lot of folks who've been deeply involved in the development of Colorado marijuana over the last 5 years and have a great deal of experience. That said, let me plunge in very quickly just to frame a little bit initially for MED. And okay, we'll go to the very first slide. Let me just, so that we're all sort of on the same page. And first of all, you know, I recognize we have some diverse stakeholders out here in the audience, presumably largely municipal, folks at the municipal level from all across the country. So just to get us on the same page, I'd like to try to show this one slide to sort of try to convey what the Colorado framework looks like. And I'm going to tell you, I think the central challenge for Colorado, or one of them, has been the complexity of the framework we created and the difficulty we've had in making sure that the public and our policymakers and law enforcement and local licensing authorities understand, and largely the public understand, what we've created in Colorado. So this is an attempt here on this graphic to show in one slide what the system actually looks like. And so MED is responsible. We're concerned about those two-tone box that's on the right-hand side of the slide. That denotes the commercial regulated license slice of Colorado marijuana activity. That's where sales occur. That is the tracked, taxed, and tested activity in Colorado. The challenge becomes that when we march onto the left side of the screen, where we have the two-tone box, which is the smaller, what we're calling the private citizen segment, that we really can call the legal unregulated side, effectively, of Colorado activity. And I guess what's helpful for this slide is to understand the basic philosophy that underlines our framework. That if marijuana activity in Colorado doesn't fit into one of these two-tone boxes, it's illegal. It's red, it's illegal, and then we go to my friend to the left here, Paul Street, and local, effectively, law enforcement is responsible for that activity that falls into the red, and it's illegal activity. So we can go into this in a little more detail, but it's an attempt here on one slide to capture who's got responsibility for what. But MED's got the slice to the right, and I would suggest to you that over time what we've tried to do is grow the box on the right and shrink the box on the left, even though it's legal unregulated. But we certainly want to shrink the activity that's in the red to the extent we can. So moving on from there, and I'm certainly going to invite, when I show this slide, it always encourages reaction, and some people don't like it or they want to add things at the margin. And so, you know, to my colleagues here, if you think there are pieces that we can improve on this, let me know. Okay, so the next slide is just to give you a sense of the scope of what's going on in Colorado right now. We have 3,000 separate business licenses across the state. You know, largely concentrated, probably 35% of those licenses sit right here in the city and county of Denver, or thereabouts. The reason I do like showing this slide is that if you go down the list of license types, over time, those categories have proliferated, and it's a reflection, I think, of the maturity and the development of the industry, that we get more specialized. The industry says, you know, we've had transporters sort of operating on the margins or sort of in an unregulated, in a more unregulated way. Why don't we go ahead and go to the legislature and let's formalize that, and let's actually make transporters, or let's formalize and license operators. So that's what's happened. The one piece that's missing here that's pretty significant, R&D and R&D cultivations, research and development, that was provided for in statute, and those have been added to this list as well. But it's just a reflection of how we continue to develop and mature, and that arguably here we are, Colorado, 5 years in on the recreational retail side, and arguably we're maybe more at the margins, while maybe some of our other colleague states maybe on the front end and doing sort of the big, focusing still on these larger license types. We start to see development of additional license types. Okay, so next, we've got about 40,000 folks who are licensed in the industry, who can work with occupational badges of various levels. That's owners, managers, and employees. That doesn't mean that every single one of these 40,000 folks is working currently as a full, as an FTE somewhere in the industry in Colorado. It simply means that they've received a badge from the MED, they've gotten a criminal background check, and we have given them a badge that they can carry around, and they can go work in one of our licensed establishments or businesses across the state. Okay. The next, one more. Here we go. What do we have? Okay, here we go. We're up here, yeah. So we show this just to, that Marijuana Enforcement Division resources are spread across the state of Colorado. We have our main office here in the Denver area. We do all business licensing out of that office, so statewide business licensing runs through headquarters. But we do have offices, Longmont, which is northern Colorado, Colorado Springs to cover the southern part of the state, and then out in the western slope. And we do occupational badging out there, which effectively is it's good for customer service. But maybe more important, we have investigators out there who their job is to ensure that there is regular contact and regular oversight of our licensees across the state. So we're working very closely with our local licensing authorities. That means boards and commissions or local boards who are approving local licensing, and with law enforcement, which is critical at both the local, state, and federal level. Okay, and then lastly, just because it's fun to show pictures, these are pictures of a couple pictures here of our metric system, which is our sort of flagship seed-to-sale inventory tracking system, which many of you, if you're from states who have adopted a seed-to-sale tracking system, I would submit to you that this is a critical component of how we have ensured accountability in the state of Colorado. This was mandated by statute. I think it's been one of those areas that we've had some success over the past 5 years. One thing I would say, though, is the inventory tracking system doesn't stand on its own. It has multiple other systems that back it up and reinforce the effectiveness of an inventory tracking system. And in this case, we have surveillance, which is required at all of our licensees. We have books and records requirements, so a myriad of requirements, which in that overlapping way helps ensure accountability and encourages compliance throughout the industry. So I think with that, that's the only introduction we'll do, and I appreciate your time.
See, these guys submitted their slides yesterday, and they're on here. I submitted mine a week ago, and we can't find them.
Do any of these look like it?
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah.
Any of those look like it?
Let's see here.
We've been busy.
Measuring the impacts.
That goes to the
Enforcement against illegal.
I can
Do
email your
do you have
slides.
any idea what happened?
Does it know this?
What do you think right there?
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know if that's mine. Do you know if mine got loaded in here?
This is not it.
Coming?
Yeah.
Oh, wait, am I on? Good. While we're waiting for Paul to come up, You know, it does occur to me that the opportunity to have, you know, state and local sitting side by side is, I think it's a hallmark, I think, of what Colorado has tried to do. But it occurred to me yesterday when I was sitting here listening to Ashley Kilroy and the panel that, you know, kicked things off with municipalities in, what was it, Vegas and Sacramento, LA, and some other folks, that there was, at one point, there was a conversation about sort of the conflict or tension between, which is understandable, between state and local authorities. And I think that's sort of an inherent part of maybe the challenge, and at the same time, maybe the genius of what we're trying to work through here. But you know, I was just reminded when Paul just threw me under the bus for us, you know, turning my PowerPoints in yesterday, as opposed to last week when I was supposed to. But anyway, that was my attempt to fill the gap. There you go.
That was my one opportunity to throw the director of the MED under the bus. So. Okay, so real quick, my name's Paul Street. I'm a detective with Denver Police Department. A little background on me. I've been a police officer for 22 years. I was a police officer in Massachusetts for 6 years, and then I came to Denver in 2001. In 2013, the Denver Police Department recognized that, well, let me back up. I work out of the Department of Excise and Licenses where Brian works, and historically, there's always been a DPD detective assigned to the Department of Excise and Licenses for liquor-related issues and other licensing issues. When we knew we were going to go live with retail marijuana in 2014, the Denver Police Department recognized there would be an additional need for an additional detective in excise and licenses. There was an interview process for that. My old partner, Aaron Kafer, who's not with us in the department anymore, he's since promoted to sergeant and went to patrol. He ultimately came over to excise and licenses. He was swamped when we went live with retail marijuana January 1, 2014. The commander, who was the lieutenant at the time, James Henning, reached out to me and asked me if I was still interested in the job. I said, absolutely. I came over and we were off and running. So here we are now. Again, Aaron Kafer's left, but we've got myself up in excise and licenses, Detective Joe Delmonico, who's there. He throws down on some of the marijuana stuff when he can because we need the help, but he's primarily up there for the liquor-related licensing issues. And then our latest addition is Detective Tom Sanchez, who's standing in the back of the room. He took Aaron Kafer's spot. So that's how we're built out currently. We have a lot to do up there. We're very busy. Just like Jim said, there's a big bulk of the marijuana licenses are in the city and county of Denver alone. So we definitely have our work cut out for us. So this is really through a law enforcement lens, but I think everyone could understand why we care about marijuana. And some of the folks that are in this room, we spoke last night and you saw the slide, but some of these things are pretty self-explanatory. You know, Schedule I mind-altering drug, we could argue about that all day, but today it still remains that way. And as a representative of law enforcement, we're concerned about Schedule I drugs, of course. Licensing's created the industry. We can talk a little bit about that later. Black market is booming. It was surely booming in 2014 when we went live with retail marijuana. And it's dropping off, but we're still very busy with black market marijuana. Look, marijuana is still illegal outside the limited exceptions provided for in our Amendment 20 and our Amendment 64, medical marijuana and retail marijuana. Outside of those exceptions, it's still illegal. So we have a concern, again, for that. We have a duty to enforce and uphold the laws, of course, and mission directives from our own agency and other city agencies. The rules, Jim's got I kind of call it my Bible, the Colorado marijuana rules and laws. That is a large portion of the framework for licensed marijuana. I use that book daily in what I do, and we can talk with questions later about what exactly that is that I do. And here it is a little bit. Regulatory and criminal cases is my job in relation to licensed marijuana businesses. Regulatory rule violations lead to administrative sanctions, fines, closures, suspension, and revocations of licenses. And finally, these are some of the common things that we see even in 2014, and this continues to be some of the main violations that we see here in Denver, and I think the MED would agree that they see a lot of these same things. Again, some of these are self-explanatory. We only have a handful of unlawful acts or criminal violations as they relate to licensed marijuana businesses, and the majority of those, or actually all of them, in Title 12 is now Title 44, are Class 2 misdemeanors, and they're, with the exception of one. Sales of retail marijuana to a person under the age of 21 is a Class 1 misdemeanor here in Colorado. That's what we have to work with. As being the cops, it's not a lot, but we got something. They are some teeth, but we can talk later. I think the teeth are truly in the administrative cases against licensed businesses, and we can talk about that later as well. So that's me, and I'm going to go sit back down since I didn't have a copy of my slides with me.
So the plan is I was going to ask these two a series of questions and maybe fill in from the Department of Excise's point of view on some of these questions if they don't hit all the points. So this first question is for both of you. In terms of enforcement, how do you feel about having two regulatory agencies, one at the local level and one at the state level? What are some of the advantages and disadvantages? Jim?
All right. This, I guess, sort of tracks back to the comment I just made earlier about having, state and local sitting side by side. I will tell you, first of all, probably like every other state, there's effectively some level of dual control, dual licensing at both the state and local level. And much of that, I think, it's effectively dictated by Constitution and statute, and in how it's done. I think what we have done in Colorado, and I think we've been successful, is because we have the bottom line is it's not a clear, bright line. I think we each know what has to happen at the local level, with licensing, and I think we know what we have to do as a statutory mandate on the state side. And I'll be candid with you. I think we've spent 5 years sort of having that conversation between state and locals to try to figure out and try to understand the challenges, deconflict, make sure that we're notifying each other as we're going through the licensing process to try to make it more efficient. But the bottom line is there are periodically challenges that we run into. I think what we've discovered is that having an engagement process regularly with both law enforcement and with local licensing authorities, that we are far more successful. One other comment that I think is necessary to make. How many folks do we have who are at the state level regulators from around the country? Can we get just a few state level? I see Michigan out there, and okay, and then at the risk of annoying you, let's how many at the municipal level folks who are here? I'm assuming that's okay. So that's the predominant. The predominant level of folks who are here. It just seems to me that we have been very successful in trying to figure out how we create that forum regularly between state and our municipalities. For example, we do regular meetings with our local licensing authorities, and I think we've discovered that one of the gaps, I think, was that we probably over time haven't been as engaged as we could have been to make sure that conversation was as happening all the time. And so if there's one takeaway for states coming online, it's to ensure that process is in place and you're aggressive in having that conversation with local licensing authorities.
And before Paul answers, I would add to this. Recently, probably within the last year and a half, we've started having those absolutely scheduled meetings with the MED. I think it's important to force those meetings so that you have a continuous conversation, because there's obviously turnover. There's obviously, different priorities. In the last year and a half, I would say things have gotten so much better from Denver's point of view in terms of compliance and how fast we can get things done, because we've had, every 2 months, every quarter, we have different meetings where it's like, this is what we're seeing. How can you guys help us? How can we help you? And for 2 years prior to that, we kind of lost some communication. So if I was going to recommend to anybody at a local level that has a state regulatory agency, set up a quarterly meeting that doesn't come off the books, maintain that relationship and maintain that dialogue, because once you lose it, you're going to be out there kind of floundering on your own until you can reestablish it.
Yeah, I would agree with both Jim and Brian on the communication piece. When I started in 2014, prior to 2014, when we went live with recreational marijuana, and I was preparing to go to an interview for a new job to regulate marijuana that no one was doing at the Denver level, the only one that was doing the regulation was the MED. So in preparation for that interview, I sought them out, and I went and tagged along and to see what they were doing. So from that point on, from a boots on the ground perspective, I'm in communication with the MED almost daily. And I recognize the importance of that relationship as again, boots on the ground investigator. We have to have that dialogue. We have to have that sharing of information. I can't do my job without some of the resources I have at the MED. So it's been vital to me doing my job. So aside from what they had pointed out of, some of these regular meetings and communication falling off at a bigger level with folks from excise and licenses, some policy-making people, and these group roundtables. I agree that we need to continue that. You guys have to do that in your own jurisdictions, but again, have your guys that are out there doing it talk to these people regularly. A good example is that that metric system that was talked about by Jim. I don't have direct access to that from a local, from a local PD's perspective. The MED accesses all that tracking, and violations, inventory-related violations are a huge problem in the marijuana world, and I rely on them to provide me some of that information when I file my administrative cases related to inventory problems. So it's a great relationship. It's not without its hurdles and some issues in the past, but we've gotten past a lot of things and have kept our eye on the ball about the importance of that relationship and how we exchange information. So really no disadvantages to a dual licensing system. And I'll just add a couple things to that. The two sets of eyes, we've got MED investigators and local investigators looking at these things. Oftentimes we do investigations jointly where we're out at a facility together, and there might be a MED investigator that's seeing something that I'm not seeing. And likewise, same thing, I'm seeing things that they might not be seeing. We're sharing this information, and we're digging through that book, and we're educating the licensees, and we're also holding them accountable by filing some of these cases, and we're doing that jointly. So it's a good relationship.
Can I have one comment here about, it goes to the advantage of sort of the interest at both the local and state level. One of the things we hear periodically, and I'm sure you've all heard at both the municipal and state level, is folks will ask you, or the public will ask you, how often are you going in and inspecting your licensees? Are you actually boots on the ground looking and making sure that folks are following the law and they're not diverting material, et cetera? And so I think there's an impulse to be defensive about it and say, well, yeah, we need to get in there, twice a year, and we have 3,000 licenses. That's why I wanted to show you that, so you have a sense of the expanse. Plus, Colorado's a pretty big state, and so if we were going to get out and be present personally in every licensed establishment or business, it would be tough. The point is, what we have to do and what you all can do is say that we're not alone. We have all these other agencies agencies and all these other resources. It's not just law enforcement. It may be code enforcement, it's fire, it's Department of Public Health. So you have this whole sort of range of organizations and institutions that are all keeping an eye on our licensees. And I think that's been the answer that we've given frequently when folks have said, well, why aren't you going in and making personal inspections? Because although we might like to do that, organizationally, trying to have the capacity right now to do that is very, very challenging. But what we do is we rely on our local agency partners.
Next question. If you knew then what you know now, how would your current approach be different if you were building a regulatory agency from the ground up?
So, that's probably above my pay grade to answer that question. But I can certainly throw my 2 cents into that, and I think Jim can elaborate to how they would do things differently over there. For a city that was starting this with no one to go to and ask questions or try to figure this out and have to hit the ground running and come up with this all on their own is amazing. I think this, and so I'm not gonna, I guess I'm taking my opportunity to get on the Denver, is doing a great job soapbox here. But really, to do that from nothing and to be where we are today, I don't know, if you asked anyone from any one of the individual agencies in Denver that are involved in marijuana regulation, I'm certain they could tell you that there were some things that they would do differently. Overall, though, I think Denver's done an outstanding job of getting to where we are today. Some small bumps in the road, but I'm not the person to answer the question about how I would start this from the ground up. I think it was done pretty well. And you guys can learn from I think, some small mistakes we've made, but overall, this is a good model. I'm a proponent of it. I'm passionate about what we're doing, and I think we've done a great job. Jim?
Okay. Yeah, no, this is an inspired question. I don't know how Brian came up with this one, but I think because there are a bunch of takeaways, I think, here, particularly for jurisdictions who are coming online, because I think we have been successful. Here we are 5 years in, and I think we're in a good place. That said, I think there are some things that maybe we could have focused on from the get-go. And let me just speak specifically from the MED perspective. One thing is we found that we needed to build a research and development analytical capability within MED to look at data. And I think probably when we started out, and I wasn't here at the very get-go, but we have audience members who were part of that conversation. And of course, always the challenge is you need the resources, you need the budget, and the authority to spend it. And that is a significant challenge, particularly at the state level, because it's not as nimble as we would like. But the bottom line is we have built particularly over the last couple of years at MED, a real capability for hiring data analysts. We need someone who can work with labs and testing. So we now have someone who's a chemist on staff who can look at that stuff. But the bottom line is having that staff who can do that sort of R&D component, which is not, those are not skill sets that are typically found in law enforcement agencies where we came from. And as we've all heard, this is a rapidly evolving industry with a lot of smart entrepreneurs out there who are pushing the limits, and we have to have skill sets at MED to be able to try to keep up. I'll tell you, having CPAs, having certified fraud examiners, so CFEs on staff, those are the kinds of skill sets that if I were tasked with at the get-go from doing again, looking about how you would find those and create those units on staff. The other thing I think is worth thinking about is making sure that you have budget to hire, in the absence of those skill sets, having consultants who can help you. We have gone out a couple times for market and demand studies, which have been incredibly important, I think, in developing our regulatory framework and being able to answer questions for the public and for the General Assembly and industry. In fact, here is our 2017 market study that we went out through the University of Colorado, and those folks produced an updated report for us. But the point is having the resources so you can pay for consultants, economists to be able to do that kind of work, because those are not the skill sets that you're going to necessarily find in-house. I was struck, for some of you who are sitting downstairs, just before this session, there was one on, with some packaging and labeling issues that were covered. Having those kinds of packaging and labeling experts who are available, who you could call in. We do rulemaking where we bring folks, stakeholders in to try to do rulemaking every year. The dilemma with relying on bringing experts into rulemaking is that typically those folks are there because they have some interest, typically some financial interest. What I think the regulators need is we need independent third-party folks who are beholden to us to give us and, say, our Department of Public Health that independent scientific or expertise. And having that resource is something I think that if we went back in time to be able to have those folks earlier in the process would be very helpful. Other than that, I'd say technology is one other piece, that making sure that you're looking at your legacy systems and seeing if maybe you want to upgrade early.
And I would say from excise and licenses point of view, we issue something like 180 different types of licenses that our inspectors were responsible for inspecting. And then we threw marijuana on them. And obviously that book is pretty big, and they still have to be concerned about liquor, short-term rentals, swimming pools, hotels. They were already going out and inspecting. And when we got to marijuana, it was not so much inspecting, it was investigating, and then writing down your reports so that the city attorney could eventually show cause or take disciplinary action. And that wasn't their skill set. Their skill set was more of, I show up and make sure you have the correct signage and the place is safe and things like that. If I were starting over 5-6 years ago, I'd be looking to bring in inspectors that had more law enforcement background, I would say, or something similar to that, where they know they have to take pictures, they know how to write a report, they know how to express what they saw in the field, much like a criminal act where a police officer does that. We just didn't have that skill set at the time, but we're gaining it over the last 6 or 7 months with our report writing and kind of how we're going to report violations that we see in the field. So that's something else to think about if you're a local agency and you think you're going to throw it, marijuana inspections on your building department. Have they ever written a report? Have they ever testified at a hearing about violations? Things like that. So I'd be looking for that skill set for anybody that's going to be going out and doing marijuana inspections.
Brian, let me add to that really quick. Our detectives, myself and the other 2 detectives, we're housed out of the Department of Excise and Licenses, which I think is really important because we're in direct communication with the people that are doing everything from the front end, the licensing technicians, intake of these licenses. We can get eyes on and help them work through some of those licensing issues, like anything questionable that may have come up on a criminal background or something. We're available to the Excise and Licenses to review those things from a police point of view. And then also, to Brian's point, those inspectors have our ear, and they're an office away from us. They walk over, we speak to them daily, and they ask our advice regularly on, hey, I've got this situation, what do you think? I've got this situation, what do you think? Hey, I'm thinking about putting this to paper, what does that look like? We help them with all those things, and I think we're getting to where Brian wants to be with his inspectors, and it's only because of, not only, but a big part of that is because we're available to them. So if you're contemplating having police officers involved in your enforcement efforts with license licensed marijuana, and you've also got, these folks that are handling the licensing or civilian inspectors, I think it's important that those people are close to each other and communicating.
Thanks. What did you not foresee, and how have you resolved it, or has it not been resolved?
Take a shot.
Take a shot.
Yeah, I think one that you all probably are largely interested in, and I'm not saying who did or didn't foresee it, but one thing I think that the state as a whole maybe didn't envision was the persistence here 5 years later of the illicit market in Colorado. That is a central challenge. I think that's something that we can have some conversation about because I think it animates a lot of the attention that the General Assembly and policymakers have paid here over the last 2 years to address illicit market activity in Colorado. Let me just say, I think, and obviously Paul can talk to this because he's looking at it from the law enforcement perspective. From the licensed regulated slice, what our exposure is largely that looping smurfing issue, the looping where they're coming back to the same licensee, or smurfing where they're doing serial sales at repeated sales, and obviously exceeding possession limits. What we're concerned with, particularly on the commercial side, is that looping smurfing issue, and largely how that is feeding demand out of state. Colorado may be a special animal because of the fact of our geography, where we're located centrally, that we just so happen to have. There are actually 3 states to our east that are not medical or recreational at this time at all, and so we may be seeing sort of different dynamics here than maybe some of the western states that you're seeing. But here's the reason this matters. The reason it matters is that whenever there's black market activity, whether it's stuff that happens, obviously, that we're responsible for, in looping or smurfing, but more predominantly where we have black market activity, illicit grows and cultivations which are occurring around the state. Every time that occurs, it is directly attributed to us at MED, at the Marijuana Enforcement Division, that somehow the assumption is, because folks didn't look at the diagram that we showed at the very beginning of the presentation to understand, the box on the right is our box. But those illegal cultivations are happening in the red, or they're happening under the cover of that two-tone box to the left. But the point is, it's attributed to us, and it erodes. The argument is it erodes our credibility at MED. So we have a clear interest in doing what we can to support local law enforcement and state law enforcement and even federal law enforcement to address the black market activity across the state.
And I'm going to add to that point, and that's what I was thinking too. The industry has created an ability for people, criminal actors that want to operate under camouflage and mixed in with other licensed businesses. It was really easy in the beginning, say, for example, in commercial buildings in Denver, if there was a commercial grow, a licensed, abiding by all the rules and laws, commercial grow on a street, and 2 addresses down, there's another similar sized commercial building that has a grow facility, and that the licensed businesses around them were allowing for that camouflage, and they were very good at operating for a long time. It wasn't until we were getting into these commercial buildings with the fire department regularly and identifying who was legitimately operating and who wasn't, that we were able to get rid of some of that piece of the black market, really. So again, I agree with Jim that it does oftentimes come back on, because black market marijuana is coming from 2 places. It is coming from the licensed industry, and is it coming from the people that I just talked about, the people that are camouflaged and just completely operating illegally. I get calls from other state jurisdictions regularly that's saying, hey, we got an interdiction stop, we've got a bunch of marijuana packaging that came from a licensed marijuana business. I can give you case example after case example of investigations that I've done in conjunction with the MED. A woman that was a medical marijuana patient met up with some folks from Iowa. They came down here for a long weekend. They hit every medical marijuana business that they couldn't purchase marijuana at. She was a registered marijuana patient. She would buy her 2 ounces of marijuana at 7, 8 different stores. Then these guys are tripping back to Iowa with 4 or 5 pounds of marijuana in their car. State troopers make that stop. It gets related to the Longmont MED office because there's marijuana packaging in there. They confirm that many of those purchases were in Denver. I'm reached out to by the MED. One thing leads to another. We have a felony case on this medical marijuana patient. So that's an example of how licensed and regulated marijuana is finding its way into the black market. So again, you kind of stole my thunder on the black market stuff, but yeah, that's what I see. I guess I didn't realize what the impact of licensed marijuana would have on the black market. It just, especially in 2014, it was a flood of activity. Our marijuana team, which some of you heard from last night, they're very busy with that. Our interdiction team, Tommy Sanchez, our new detective, was part of that interdiction team. That's the cocaine and methamphetamine stuff that they used to see is now predominantly marijuana investigations. So, yeah, we're seeing that. I think it's falling off. And I think where we'll see that fall off is with regulated and licensed marijuana coming to other states, because the demand outside of Colorado in states where it's not allowed in some form under the law is still very high. Once that dies down and we see more licensing and legalized marijuana, we're going to see that fall off a little bit.
Let me just mention some of the things that Colorado has done, because I think it's informative for you all, because I think, I saw 3 years ago, and this goes to those folks, the law enforcement folks in the room, the importance of having that conversation among policy-level law enforcement people to make sure that they're informing policymakers of what they're actually seeing in the field. So the point is, we had prevalent a lot of instances of black market, illicit market cultivations around the state, and law enforcement was seeing it regularly, whether it was here in Denver or down in the Colorado Springs, Pueblo area, and particularly residential grows. These were drug trafficking organizations, DTOs, frequently from out of state, sort of hiding effectively in plain sight, and operating under the cover of the legal, unregulated space, or just operating brazenly in the red space. The point was that message was taken to policymakers. It made its way then from the governor's office and our leadership, and the General Assembly addressed it then through enacting a 12-plant count limit in residential areas. The point is, the reason that Colorado, I think, has created through the Constitution was this gap that allowed home grows. And I know as other states come online, they may look more carefully at that allowance, that gap, arguably, with home grows. But that bill was enacted a couple years ago. There's now a 12-plant count limit in residential areas. The General Assembly also funded the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to set up a illicit marijuana team. CBI is, they have to be called in. They don't have, say, primary jurisdiction, but they can be called in by local law enforcement to assist at the local level. So there's an ongoing resource need throughout the state for enforcement resources. So that CBI team has stepped up, and then there's law enforcement grants that the General Assembly also made available. So I think this is part of the effort to try to respond to that illicit market activity.
So I'm sure most everybody in the room knows about the Sweet Leaf investigation. At the very basic level, it was a marijuana facility or group of facilities that would allow the maximum purchase of marijuana kind of repeatedly throughout the day, and I'll kind of leave it at that. So, two-part question kind of for both of you. How did the investigation into Sweet Leaf start for you, Paul? And then what type of resources did the MED have at its disposal to assist with the prosecution? And that's for you, Jim. So you want to talk about the start of, you already hit on kind of that out-of-state thing,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, sure. So I'll start by saying that the Sweet Leaf investigation is still ongoing. It's at its final stages, but again, there's parts of that investigation that I'm not authorized to speak to in a public forum, so we're not going to go too deep into it, but I can tell you how it started. Real quickly, for those of you that aren't familiar with Sweet Leaf, Sweet Leaf was a licensed marijuana business. They were one of the larger operators in the city and county of Denver. They had several stores here, a few grow facilities, some office space. Basically, how this started was through a citizen complaint. And citizens began noticing a lot of vehicle and foot traffic surrounding one of the Sweet Leaf retail storefronts. So we got that complaint. We started looking into it, and like the cops do, we set up and started watching things. And we confirmed what the neighborhood's concerns were, that yes, there was an abundance of traffic at that one store. In an area where, I'll note, there were other marijuana stores that didn't have near the traffic that this one store did. So again, we're going, well, you know, what's happening here? So we set up on it, we watched it, and what we saw was there was a lot of out-of-state traffic coming into there, a lot of out-of-state license plate vehicles that would park near that facility, and they would be there for hours upon hours. And as we watched, we would see the individual associated with that car, where the term looping came from. They were just looping in and out of that store over and over and over again. And these were 1 ounce purchases. They were making, in Colorado, recreational marijuana, you can buy up to an ounce. So they were purchasing an ounce every time, and they would do this 16, 20, 30 times in a day. And these same people would come back and spend a weekend here doing the same thing. So that's how it kind of began. And ultimately what happened is we made these same observations at all of their stores. That was time intensive. There was a lot of investigation that went into that, a lot of officers going in and making their own purchases. So we documented all that with audio, video footage. We made a few stops of individuals that were making these purchases at these stores, confirmed some things that we didn't know, or confirmed some things that we did know, found out some things that we certainly didn't know, and concluded that a lot of this marijuana was finding its way out of the state of Colorado. So ultimately, we got to the point where we served executed search warrants at all of their facilities, and we recovered a lot of finished marijuana, a lot of computers, and then the investigation really began because we're digging into personal computers, company computers, point of sale systems, on and on and on. So here we are almost 2 years later, and that investigation is still ongoing. So.
And I just wanted to say, the point of that question is it almost started out as a parking complaint, or just a lot of people in my neighborhood. So that's.
Well, and it really did. I mean, and it goes back to, you know, we're responding to the community has a expectation that we're going to respond to them when they're concerned about what's happening in their neighborhood. And this is a good example of what that communication looks like with our community. There's that expectation that not only are we going to properly regulate the licensed industry, but when they make a complaint or have a concern about what's happening in their neighborhoods with licensed marijuana businesses, you have to expect that they want some action taken, and I think we've done a good job of responding to our citizens in that way.
Part two?
Part two.
Part two. Yeah, again, as Paul said, I'm just going to speak to the open source stuff and avoid the details here. But I would encourage you, if you Google Sweetleaf, you can find all sorts of details that are out there in the Denver Post and elsewhere. But it clearly suggests sort of a cautionary tale, which I think is useful for many of you just to see what can happen in the licensed regulated industry. And I think the success that we had working as a team in addressing what's happened in that case. So clearly, this was about teamwork. This was about, particularly from MED's perspective, being able to provide data to, in this case, DPD, Denver PD, as they were doing their investigation. So in particular, that relates to our metric data from our inventory tracking system. We now have granular, regular event level sales data, which is obviously exceptionally useful. Maybe waste logs, surveillance. Our licensees are required to maintain 40 days of record keeping on their surveillance systems. We have licensee files, so we've done financial backgrounds on all these folks and owners. We know who their employees are because all that has to be entered into metric. So the point is, we have that data resource that we can funnel to Paul and his team. One thing Paul mentioned earlier that I think is something that's worth you all thinking about, because this is an inherent tension between the us at the state level and at the local level. We have this system metric, the reason I showed you those photos of it, so you could see what the plant and package tags look like. Those are RFID tags on each one of those plants or packages. But the point is that data is pretty robust. The question I think that we continue to wrestle with is the extent to which we share that data. And I think traditionally that was seen as it's a state system, it's state data. But that said, the only way we really leverage the effectiveness of that data is when we share it effectively with local law enforcement. So what we're working toward is being able to build reports which can go routinely to local law enforcement, recognizing there's a lot of proprietary data in there, and we have an obligation to protect it. But I think we're working through how again, it goes back to what we said earlier about having all these multiple resources and organizations looking at operations across the state and looking at individual licensees. Metric is an incredibly powerful tool, and so to the extent to which we're sharing that data in a responsible way, that's something we're looking at.
And before I forget this, I want to give credit where credit's due to my old partner, Aaron Kafer, who I mentioned had recently promoted. He authored the original search warrant in this Sweetleaf case and was the case agent on this. And I'll tell you what, I've never seen better detective work and a better search warrant written. This initial search warrant in this case was over 40 pages long. It was extensive. There was a huge amount of effort put into that by him on his own, and we were just kind of on the sidelines doing the grunt work and doing a lot of the heavy lifting. But he was the orchestrator behind a lot of that investigation, and I can tell you, without his expertise and ability to write the way he could write a search warrant, we probably wouldn't have been as successful as we were. And again, we're not at the end here, but I think we've had some good success with that case, and I attribute it to him.
For the jurisdictions out there that started off with medical and are now going recreational, what are some of the key differences in your operations as it pertains to medical versus recreational?
Absolutely. You want me to kick it off?
Yeah, sure.
Well, it's sort of an interesting question because I think what we're seeing right now is sort of a convergence of medical and rec. Here's the fundamental problem in Colorado. We have we have Amendment 20, which created medical, and we got Amendment 64 that created created retail or recreational. So the dilemma is they came from different places, they were created for different reasons, and yet I think what we'd like to do, or I think what some policymakers would like to see, is this convergence of the two, recognizing that what are the real distinctions, because even though they have different constitutional roots. We have different production management, and what I mean by that is how do we ensure that we're not overproducing, that we're matching up supply and demand, and so that's different on the medical and recreational side that we could certainly talk about. There are issues with what we call vertical integration that affect production management that we're working through as we speak. One piece about this convergence suggestion is we have a sunset report that you can certainly go take a look at. It just was released. I believe it is online. That is looking at both the the medical and the retail code this year, and the General Assembly will be looking at that in the next few months. But it recommends effectively that we go to a single code, and that for the sake of simplicity and compliance from the industry, that's probably a great thing. From the sense of us internally as investigators at MED to have a single code that we're looking at, that would be a whole lot easier. And this, of course, is I showed it earlier because Paul made me, or you made me. But this is the LexisNexis compilation. This year, we'll get a new one here in probably 2 or 3 months. And we have to choose the color. This one is Purple Haze. I'm not sure what the next one will be, but it keeps getting thicker every year. If there's an opportunity here in this consolidation to put them together, it will obviously get smaller. But the point of that operationally is I think it will assist us in compliance because the code will be shorter. Let me just make one other point about medical and retail, because it's another sort of cautionary note about what happens when you delineate medical and retail. We have something called equivalency, which we put into the retail code about 3 years ago, which means that we have an equivalency between 1 ounce of flour and concentrate and marijuana products. So, 1 ounce would equal 8 grams of concentrate and 10 milligram servings of marijuana product. That is embedded in code now, in rule. The dilemma is, and it was directed by statute, the dilemma is, so that's on the rec side. There's no equivalency in medical right now. So what that means is it arguably could feed, say, a looping smurfing scenario where folks are going from licensee to licensee purchasing medical product because there's no equivalency in place on the medical side. That is admittedly a gap in our code that we need to address, and of course it is addressed in the sunset provision. But that gives you an example, I think, of what can happen when you have 2 separate medical and retail codes as an example.
Yeah, and I'll add to that really quickly with medical marijuana. If someone has a patient recommendation for elevated plant and ounce counts, to Jim's point, if I'm a medical marijuana patient with that EPC recommendation from a doctor, and say it's the maximum or one of the highest we've seen here locally, 33 ounces, 99 plants. And there's no limit on the amount of concentrates or flour. I'm in possession of a lot of marijuana, and we've seen that. I think we would agree that a lot of the black market marijuana is coming from medical marijuana industry, not so much the retail marijuana.
And I think the real question there for diversion out of state is that one would think these, sort of more highly processed concentrates and they're easier to conceal, they're more compact. I think that's where we sense that we want to really look carefully at how this may feed that pipeline and those kinds of cases.
And just one last thing, to add to that consolidation and making it one code, it definitely would, I think it benefits us, from a law enforcement perspective, but more so I think it benefits the industry because the medical marijuana tracking and inventory and keeping track of your medical marijuana inventory has been very difficult for the industry. I can say this because I've filed many cases against marijuana businesses that have been in violation of that exact thing. They just can't keep track of, a medical marijuana business can only have or produce as much medical marijuana that they have patients for that are registered at their centers, okay? So it's very difficult sometimes for people in the industry to keep track of that. You've got to monitor it daily. If you're, growing hundreds and hundreds of plants, that can be difficult. So I think it would alleviate that responsibility for the industry too and help them out a little bit.
Do you want to ask at the end, or?
Just want to ask one quick question here. On the MED, one of your earlier slides showed the total number of businesses, and I think it showed 11 and 11 in terms of testing facilities for both the medical and the retail. And then also on the transport, you had 9 and then 13. And I was wondering, is there a distinction why you have to keep those separate? It seems like transport and testing could be commingled, but for some reason on the slide you showed them separately. Is that a distinction because you have testing facilities for each type? Does that make sense?
It does. So I think the question he was referring to, if you all didn't hear it, was on that earlier chart of licensed businesses on the medical and retail side. It showed the same for testing facilities, 11 on both sides, and for some reason there was a difference on. I would simply, first of all, I would attribute to, because we're required, because we have separate statutes on both sides, so we have to license them. They are technically licensed separately, but for all intents and purposes, we believe in business efficiency. They're operating right side by side. They're the same businesses. So it is. So it's a good point. It's effectively it's a partially misleading slide because it doesn't mean that there are 3,000 separate locations throughout the state of Colorado, but it means that they're separate. There are 3,000 distinct licenses, but they're frequently co-located.
So I can't speak to his slide. I didn't really see it, but with the 9 and 13 transporter licenses, there are two types of transporter licenses. There's a brick and mortar location, and then separate. You don't have to actually have a brick and mortar location to have a transporter license. So I don't know if that played into what we're seeing on that slide, but that's a possibility. Probably does.
As other states legalize, do you see a difference? Do you see any differences in the behaviors of our market versus other states?
Let me start out here and just focus initially on what we call production management, because I think it's a place that Colorado's had some success. That said, I think it's a place that we keep a very close eye on, because what we're concerned about, and we just met, by the way, with our state counterparts. I think we had the session before this. There was some conversation about what kind of engagement occurs state to state, and we do it. We have a very robust state to state regulator roundtable at the state level that we've now just completed our 4th meeting. I think there's some of my colleagues who were just with us here in Boston just last week. But we trade notes with our colleagues, say, for example, up in Oregon and Washington, where they have different dynamics that are going on there with how cultivations work. They have a plethora. I guess California is the same for all of you who feel the pain, but it's the outdoor cultivation scenario, which Colorado was not impacted quite as heavily by. But that ends up creating sort of a seasonal glut, if you will, as I understand, and it causes inventory problems, and then ultimately it causes pricing issues as well. So the point is, though, that Colorado has looked really carefully at production management and making sure that we're calibrating supply and demand on both the retail and medical side. One thing I think we will see over time here, as I think Paul alluded to it, we're seeing more states come online. Clearly, Colorado has I think, a special sensitivity because we're surrounded traditionally by a number of states that, at least until not long ago, didn't have medical or recreational. We had a special responsibility to do all we could to make sure that our product wasn't going over the borders. As clearly, that's beginning to shift. New Mexico is a medical state, for example, and those conversations continue. But I think the geographic issue with us puts us means we have some special sensitivities here.
So I think two things that I think the industry folks may agree with too. What we're seeing here locally in Colorado with legalization in other states is two things. We're seeing more consolidation of licensed businesses here in Colorado, and we're currently obviously seeing a decrease or a reduction in the price of marijuana here in Colorado. At one point in 2014, for example, a pound of marijuana here was about $2,000. Now a pound of retail marijuana is selling from anywhere between $750 and $850, and there may be someone in here that could correct me about that, but I might be in the ballpark there. So those are the two things. I think we're seeing a lot of people, some folks that aren't able to sustain some of these issues, and increased costs of operating, and the decrease in the revenue generated from sales. We're seeing the consolidation and the lower cost of marijuana. So.
Nothing to add. Okay.
I can make something up.
Nope.
Go ahead.
Nope, this is my last question, one that I feel strongly about. Do you think that criminal prosecutions versus regulatory prosecutions or administrative actions are more effective with generating compliance within the industry?
Well, let me start off by saying I think I'm not sure that's supposed to be a softball or it's.
I think it's a softball, and
I think we've been successful because you need to be credible across the range of sanctions. So, MED is a special animal because we have both regulatory responsibility as well as criminal enforcement authority as well. So I think we're sensitive to the fact that we have that range of the range of sanctions available to us, and I think it's important to be able to. Working with our law enforcement partners, with our regulatory partners. I mean, the reality is if you're a licensee in the state of Colorado, you have to realize that you're answering both civilly and criminally at the local level. You're answering civilly and criminally to us. You're answering ultimately criminally to the federal government at a minimum. So there are a lot of folks who are sort of have eyes on and paying close attention. And so, I would say from that I think it's been important. We've had a discussion about the importance, I think, of our licensee community. They're well aware that they place a lot in jeopardy when if they don't abide by the rules because they face both criminal and civil sanctions.
So I'd add to that, it really, and we're just talking about licensees here, not people outside of the license market. I think it really depends on the individual, because I might be really taken back by being charged with a crime and potentially having a criminal record. That may be a very big concern to me, whereas I might not be so concerned with an administrative ticket or having to show cause at hearing why I violated one of these rules. On the other hand, there might be a licensee that, if they've done their homework, many of these criminal tickets, they're minimal in fines, likely going to be able to negotiate a pretty good deal with the city attorneys, and not in all cases. I know there's some city attorneys in here, but you may be able to negotiate some type of deal where that's not going to be on your record and you're not going to be too concerned about that. Whereas these administrative cases where I personally feel that that's where the teeth is, where the teeth are, they can be extensive in monetary violations to the tone of hundreds of thousands of dollars. If I'm in a business where operating expenses are up and costs, retail sales are down, or the price of retail is down, if I'm getting hit in the pocketbook for a couple $100,000, I'm really concerned about that. So again, I think it goes back to the individual.
And the only thing that I would add, and I always use this example, is obviously we have a lot of different agencies that go into marijuana facilities. And there was one marijuana facility that was violating the fire code. And the fire department goes out there and says, hey, you need to do this, this, and this. And they go back 3 months later, they haven't done it. You need to do this, this, and this. Finally, the fire department gets around to writing them a ticket. And the ticket was $100. And for us, as a regulatory agency, for us to say, no, you can disregard the fire department 3 times until you get a ticket from the nicest fireman in the world, kind of, it played different. So I'm not sure if that was a monetary fine or whether we closed them down, but or suspended their license for a couple of days. But that suspension or that large monetary fine on their license was a whole lot more effective than the fire department going out there 3 times, and writing that $100 ticket where it's like $100. I'm not putting in that new fire exit. For $100, I ain't doing it. But when you come and deal with us and we say, no, you're not going to disregard the fire department like that, and we're going to punish you for that, like Paul was saying, the teeth are in the administrative actions. So if you're looking at disciplinary procedures in your states, that's where I think you're going to get, I personally feel that you're going to get the most compliance from people, is when it really kind of hurts, if I could say it that way.
And let me add one more factor to that. We've certainly seen, I think that's why the spectrum of being able to be flexible, that we may end up going with some criminal investigation and enforcement action. On the other hand, when we pursue it administratively, the burden of proof is lower. We can typically move far quicker. So having that range of options, I think, helps keep our industry compliant.
And that was my last question. Are there any questions from the audience?
I have one question. Thank you. I'm Ryan from the municipality of Anchorage. This is more of a code enforcement question, so it might be below the duties of you gentlemen, but just kind of curious on your insights. In Anchorage, we do have a requirement that commercial cultivation facilities cannot emit odor beyond the lot line, or odor can't be detected at the lot line of the facility. We've had an enormous amount of difficulty enforcing that due to the subjective nature of odor observations. I can go out there with a code enforcement officer and they can detect it, but I can't, or vice versa. So I'm just curious, in your experience, how do you address odor, if you do?
So our local licenses are required to submit an odor plan, and I believe, what's it called?
Odor control plan.
But the person that goes out there has a device that I think we call the smellinator. It's just something similar to that, to where he can scientifically say, I can smell marijuana from this point. I mean, I think it's an actual device that he puts on his face, and it collects a certain amount of air, and if he can detect it, then it's there. If you want, I can give you my card and put you in touch with that person, but we do have a device that smells things.
Hi, how you doing? Jeffrey, City of Portland. So this question's for Jim. You had mentioned production management. As I'm sure many people know in this room, Oregon has quite the surplus issue. And so how does Colorado address over inventory surplus issues? Do you have a way to cap that or control it?
Jeff, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just with your with Steve Marks, right?
Yes, yep.
Yeah, just days ago. So, yeah, do we have a way to, effectively in law, we have the ability to manage production management statewide. So at the end of the day, the state licensing authority, my boss, who you all saw here, Mike Hartman, we have the ability to manage that, to make sure that we're staying in line. I think the good news about this, one is you clearly have different cultivation dynamics that are occurring out there. Although I will say, for those of us in Colorado, we understand we're seeing more cultivations going in the southern part of the state in Pueblo, where maybe it's more conducive to outdoor grows, but we certainly have outdoor grows around the state. But what I will tell you right now is our most recent study that just came out a few months ago that is online. It effectively shows sales and production in line. And there is something comforting about that report because it suggests that the free market actually is working here. We have sustained pricing declines, and I think Brian just mentioned it, but somewhere on the order of 20+%. But they do not approach what you have seen, and this is on the flower side. They don't approach, as I understand, what you've seen as effectively 50% declines, if I understand right, in the past year. So I think it may be it's a function of a different industry, but I think we have the ability to ratchet it down if we need to.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hello, it's Jesse with the City of Edmonton Fire Department. My question more surrounds the home grow issue. So I've heard you guys are using the metric for 12 plants per household. Is that correct? Or that's in Colorado more so?
I'm sorry, using metric for
Sorry, like the amount that you can grow in your own home, you can use 12, right?
12
Okay.
plants, correct.
So in Edmonton, specifically Alberta, actually, we're using 4 plants per household. And what the fire department's been concerned with is individuals basically taking that and saying, well, who's going to enforce me or showcase that I can't grow 12 plants or 20 plants or whatever? So I'm just wondering, did you guys have in your experience any people growing well more than they were allowed, and what did you do to possibly enforce that?
That's for Paul.
Yeah, I can speak to that to some degree. We do have, the state has the 12 plant count. We have an ordinance that was in effect prior to that rule or that law. It's a maximum of 12 plants per household in Denver, assuming that there's 2 adults living at that house, 6 plants per household member, to a maximum of 12. But yes, the way so that ordinance allows us to, cite someone criminally if they're above that. But to answer your question, yes, that's happening all the time here. People just go over that. I mean, we're finding hundreds of plants in people's houses, and I don't know, unless you're there, unless you're getting the complaints, the citizen complaints about odor and other things, you're just not going to know about it. And certainly a fire hazard when you've got 100 plants in a basement. Right. But yeah, we're seeing it. Our marijuana team, and there's some folks in here that came to a talk last night with were you there? I'm sorry.
No, I wasn't registered for that one.
Okay, so our Denver Fire Department and some folks that are on our other marijuana team that deal with home grows were there and spoke to some of those things. But we're seeing it. It's hard to control. I think, last year we had 200 to 300 complaints on home grows. The majority of those were over the 12 plant count limit. So that's a tough one. If you could, if you're in a position to just not allow plants in the residential setting at all, in a perfect world, you could do that. But even with that, you're still going to have people that are cultivating in their homes.
Right. Thank you.
Hey, gentlemen. Thank you so much for the time. This question is for Jim. Jim Patrick from BioTrack THC. So I know looping can be a very challenging problem to solve from a prevention perspective, especially in recreational, where we're not tracking on a per-person purchase basis. But at least with respect to medical, there are a number of states that have implemented medical patient limit tracking, such as Hawaii, Illinois, New Mexico, Delaware. Does the MED intend to have Metric deploy some type of medical patient limit tracking to reduce the risk of looping from the medical side of the industry?
Does the MED intend to do? I guess what I would respond at this point is that we have the capability. We're able to pull some of that that transaction level data, which clearly has informed some of our investigations. I think one of the tensions for all of us is to try to make sure that we're balancing sort of, expectations of particularly when we talk on the medical side. There are certain sort of expectations, I think, about the respect that we have for prior practice of how we've treated that data. So I think we've certainly used it when we've had an investigation, whether and we'll take a look at what those other states are doing in a very overt way, and see if there's some opportunities there that are consistent with statute. One thing I think that your question, though, sort of goes to more broadly is it's a dynamic that all of you need to pay attention to, and it's always this question of whether you can tighten up or loosen up as you go. And I think one of the challenges for Colorado is we've created a culture around certain practices. And so as an example, this is probably a good one when you talk about medical, medical tracking. We've treated it in a certain way over the last 5 years since Metric went live in 2014. And I think we are very sensitive to making sure that we are paying attention to our very, very, we have a patient community that we care about, and they're very vocal. And so make it, as we all understand. And so I think anything we would do there, we would make sure that we're reaching out to stakeholders and seeing what sort of opportunities there are there. That's what I'd tell you for now.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Dan Zeck, Town of Moffett. I was curious on your perception on the RICO case down in Pueblo with the devaluation of property values and what that may affect the industry with.
I think that's for me. But
That's for you. No, I am not. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, are you with the Town of Moffett? Yes. Are you on the board or the manager? No,
I am a
private citizen. Yeah, I can't speak directly to the to the case and the details there. That said, what I think I can tell you is we are fully read in on activity that's and working closely with the folks down in Moffett and paying attention to some of the things that are happening down there. And as far as that case goes, I would defer to the I would defer to our communications folks, but more importantly, a conversation internally with our Attorney General's office.
No, please, I've already gone. You go ahead.
Hi, I'm Melinda Kadinger. I'm from the industry from Smokies in Colorado. And as a licensee holder, can you address the importance of, since we have so many local municipalities here, the importance of the local municipalities having a designated person as their MJ liaison or what have you, as opposed to just adding the task onto a current city official's job task, for example?
Can I add? Let me answer quickly. It's vital that someone is designated to do that job, like we have in Denver. You got to find someone that's passionate about wanting to do it. For some of this stuff, if it's going to be a law enforcement person, which I recommend it is, there's a difficulty there because this is foreign to police work, doing administrative work, and it's pretty new. So you got to find someone that's going to want to do that, and you've got to find someone that's going to really be open to communicating with the industry. You got to put any bias you have. Historically, law enforcement people have a bias towards illegal activity and marijuana. That's still currently a Schedule I drug. I think you have to really make an effort to have that person put that bias aside and have an open mind and be available to the industry to work through some of those things. I hope I'm answering your question.
Let me take one shot at that, and this it's sort of a perfect softball that we can wrap this up with, which is we're doing a panel right here with Denver, and Denver has put this symposium on for the last few years. I think Colorado has benefited immeasurably from the leadership that Denver has shown over the last few years in addressing marijuana impacts. But part of that is because they're a big city with lots of resources, and clearly it's the epicenter of marijuana activity in Colorado. I think one of the challenges, and I'm not sure exactly where Smokies, where you're working, but in an ideal world, we have local licensing authority points of contact who are your go-to people. And I'm very sensitive to this because my previous job was as a town manager. So if I'm understanding what the question was specifically, but I think it's largely dependent on the resources that municipality has. Did I hit that or not?
Yes,
Yes,
totally, but
totally.
I do want to give a shout out to City of Fort Collins because I think they did an awesome job, but it was an evolution type of thing. And it just made a world of difference in the industry, in my opinion, to have someone that was dedicated to that, advancing the industry in that way.
And I think that's a really good
And
point.
recently, we've talked about making that position in Denver. I'm going to say the word wrong, but ombudsman, to be that local contact in Denver, and we're currently looking at that.
But again, I mean, that tells you the importance of this relationship of a state and locals partnering. So, good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was, yeah. We'll be here all day.
Great. Well, Brian, so this question's for you. So you had mentioned the issue with, the example of a fire representative coming in a few times and saying, "Hey, fix this." We've been dealing with that as well. It evokes this kind of philosophical conversation we've been having, though, about whether that is more of an enforcement issue and their ability, their authority to enforce their fire code as opposed to a cannabis-specific issue. Because we have found that because of our regulations, we are very heavily regulating the cannabis industry on issues that might actually cross all sorts of industries, right? It's the process, not the product. And so if fire were to go into a facility and say, well, this doesn't rise to a level that we're going to do a stop work order, we're not going to fine them today, we'll give them a little more time, we have been leaning more towards trusting that judgment and saying, let's leave it to fire rather than do our own enforcement and try to speed up that process because we're not the substantive experts. So my question to you is, what's your rationale in landing there and trying to kind of make sure that the cannabis industry is following up on a different schedule than maybe some other industry might not be doing?
Right, so our ordinances, specifically Chapter 32, where the authority to issue licenses to the director is found, there is a section of revocation, how we can revoke a license. And it says you have to follow all codes, including the zoning code, fire code, electrical code, and all these other things.
Right.
So that gives us authority to take action if you're violating the fire code. And I see it more as a backup. I would prefer if a fire department, a fireman went into a building and said, you need to do this, this, and this, and they do it. That would be great. But if we've gone there 3-4 times, or fire's gone there 3 or 4 times, and they're just unwilling to comply, then the teeth of enforcement is that license and the ability to sell marijuana and make your living. And so that's when we become involved. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we share that authority as well, and it sounds like you use kind of discretion along the way as well.
Absolutely.
But our discretion has certainly shifted more and more towards until we get stop work orders or you can't occupy this building. Until we get to that point, we're we've been much more deferential to fires enforcement.
Exactly.
et cetera, et
And I
cetera.
think we're in the same boat. I think I mentioned that it was like the third or fourth visit, and the fire department finally wrote a ticket, and we got to the point where it was, if fire department's writing you tickets, you know, and not working with you anymore, then it's reached the level that the licensing agency needs to become involved.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
We're over. We're over time.
Thank you, guys.